Echoes of the Nexus, Episode 7. The pod doors hissed open, and Zephyr stumbled out, blinking against the harsh light. The desert stretched out before him, a vast expanse of golden sand that seemed to go on forever. The sky above was a brilliant blue, devoid of clouds, and the sun beat down with relentless intensity. Around him, other pods were opening, and the other contenders were emerging, their faces etched with confusion and uncertainty. They looked around, taking in the strange landscape, their eyes wide with wonder and fear. "What is this place?" one of them muttered, his voice trembling. "It's the first game," another replied, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. "But what are we supposed to do?" Zephyr's heart was pounding in his chest, a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The games had begun, and they were in uncharted territory. Anything could happen. He looked around, taking in the faces of the other contenders. Some he recognized, others were strangers. But they were all in this together, facing the unknown, each one fighting for survival and glory. Quilthos, the friendly contender he had met earlier, was standing nearby, his eyes wide with awe. "I never imagined it would be like this," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "It's so vast." Zephyr nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And so empty. There's nothing here, no clues, no instructions, just the desert." A sudden shout drew their attention, and they turned to see a contender pointing to the distance. "Look!" he yelled. "What's that?" They squinted, following his gaze, and saw a horizontal line on the horizon. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there, a thin shadow against the endless sand. "It's moving," someone whispered, their voice filled with disbelief. "It's coming closer." The contenders watched, their breaths held as the line grew larger, its shape becoming more defined. It was a wall, a massive barrier that stretched as far as the eye could see, gliding silently over the desert floor. "What is it?" Quilthos asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "What does it mean?" Zephyr's mind was racing, the puzzle pieces falling into place. "It's the game," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "It's the challenge we have to overcome." The wall was getting closer now, its size and scale becoming apparent. It was a monolith, a towering structure that seemed to defy gravity, its surface smooth and unbroken. The contenders looked at each other, uncertainty in their eyes. The wall was approaching, and they had no idea what to do. Zephyr's mind was racing, the puzzle pieces falling into place. "It's the game," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "It's the challenge we have to overcome." The wall was getting closer now, its size and scale becoming apparent. It was a monolith, a towering structure that seemed to defy gravity, its surface smooth and unbroken. The sun glinted off its surface, casting a harsh glare that made it difficult to look at directly. The contenders looked at each other, uncertainty in their eyes. The wall was approaching, and they had no idea what to do. Some began to pace nervously, their eyes darting back and forth between the wall and their fellow contenders. Others stood frozen, their bodies rigid with fear and confusion. The desert was silent, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind and the distant rumble of the approaching wall. The heat was oppressive, the air thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. Sweat trickled down Zephyr's forehead, stinging his eyes, but he ignored it, his focus entirely on the wall. As the wall approached, its true scale and magnitude became apparent. From a distance it had seemed like a mere shadow on the horizon, a faint line that separated the sky from the desert floor. But as it drew closer, its enormity was revealed. The wall was a monolith, a towering structure that stretched out as far as the eye could see in both directions. It stood about 30 feet tall, its surface not smooth but rather filled with cracks and crevices, a complex network of lines and fissures that crisscrossed its entire length. The wall's color was a pale sandy hue, almost blending in with the desert itself, but with a subtle metallic sheen that glinted in the harsh sunlight. Its base was slightly buried in the sand, giving the impression that it was gliding over the desert floor rather than being supported by it. The top of the wall was flat and level, but the cracks and crevices gave it a rugged, uneven appearance. As it moved, the wall cast a long, dark shadow over the desert, a stark contrast to the bright, unfiltered light of the sun. The shadow seemed to reach out, a dark hand that threatened to engulf everything in its path. The wall's approach was silent, its movement almost graceful, belying the danger it represented. There was no sound of machinery, no creaking or groaning of metal. It simply moved, a relentless force that would not be stopped. The heat of the desert caused the air above the wall to shimmer, creating a mirage-like effect that distorted its appearance. It seemed to waver and ripple, a ghostly apparition that was both solid and insubstantial at the same time. As it neared, the contenders could see the places in the wall where they could place their hands and feet to climb it. The cracks and crevices were not obvious handholds or footholds, but subtle indentations, almost as if the wall itself was challenging them to find a way to conquer it. The wall's approach was inexorable, its movement steady and unchanging. It did not slow down or pause, it simply continued on its path, a path that would soon bring it into direct contact with the contenders. They watched it, their hearts pounding in their chests, their minds racing with thoughts and strategies. The wall was a puzzle, a challenge, a test of their skill and determination, and it was getting closer. The wall was now upon them, its towering presence casting a shadow that enveloped the contenders. The cracks and crevices on its surface seemed to beckon, inviting them to climb, to conquer, to overcome. With a determined look in his eyes, Zephyr approached the wall, his hands reaching out to find the first handhold. The surface was rough to the touch, the cracks providing just enough space for his fingers to grip. He pulled himself up, his muscles straining as he began to climb. Around him, the other contenders were doing the same, their bodies moving with a mix of grace and urgency as they ascended the wall. The sound of their breathing, heavy and labored, filled the air, mingling with the occasional grunt of effort. As they climbed, the desert floor receded below them, the vast expanse of sand and sky stretching out in all directions. The wall seemed to go on forever, its top flat and unadorned, a blank canvas that offered no clues as to what lay beyond. Zephyr was almost at the top when he heard a voice calling his name. He turned to see Quilthos, one of the other contenders, gesturing towards something on the wall. "Zephyr, look!" Quilthos exclaimed, his eyes wide with surprise. "It's Shratz. Where is he going?" Zephyr followed Quilthos's gaze and saw Shratz, the small, insect-like creature, scurrying along the top of the wall. Shratz's many legs moved with incredible speed, carrying him to the left, his body hugging the surface as he scurried along. "What is he doing?" Zephyr wondered aloud, his mind racing. Shratz's behavior was puzzling, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He was not simply climbing the wall, he was heading somewhere, following a path that only he seemed to understand. The other contenders had reached the top as well, their faces flushed with exertion, their eyes following Shratz's progress. Some of them laughed, dismissing Shratz's actions as mere curiosity or playfulness. Others, like Zephyr, watched with growing concern, sensing that there was more to Shratz's behavior than met the eye. The wall continued to move, carrying them along with it, its surface smooth and unyielding beneath their feet. The desert stretched out below them, a vast and unbroken expanse that offered no answers, only more questions. The contenders stood atop the wall, their chests heaving as they caught their breath. The view from this height was breathtaking, the desert stretching out in all directions, a sea of golden sand and shimmering heat. The sky above was a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds, the sun a blazing orb that cast a harsh, unrelenting light. They took a moment to rest, to take in the beauty and the strangeness of this place. Some of them sat down, their legs dangling over the edge, their faces alight with wonder and excitement. But then, something caught their attention, a flicker of movement in the distance. One of the contenders pointed, his face turning pale, his voice trembling with fear. "Look!" he cried, his eyes wide with terror. "Behind us! Fire!" They all turned, and a collective gasp went up as they saw it, a wall of fire, a towering inferno that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was moving towards them, a relentless force of nature that consumed everything in its path. The heat was already reaching them, a wave of scorching air that made their skin prickle and their eyes water. Panic set in, a wild, frantic fear that drove them to action. They scrambled down the other side of the wall, their movements desperate and uncoordinated, their minds filled with images of flames and destruction. The wall beneath them seemed to tremble, the cracks and crevices widening as they descended, the surface hot to the touch. They reached the ground, their bodies covered in sweat, their faces flushed with exertion and fear. A few of them laughed, a nervous, shaky sound that did little to ease the tension. "That was close," one contender exclaimed, his voice filled with relief. "But we made it. We're safe." They watched as the wall they had just climbed passed through the wall of fire, its surface glowing red, the flames licking at its edges. It continued on its path, unaffected by the heat, a silent witness to their narrow escape. But then, another wall appeared, moving towards them with a speed that made their hearts sink. It was faster than the last one, its approach steady and unyielding. The laughter died down, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The contenders didn't waste any time. The sight of the approaching wall, coupled with the relentless wall of fire behind them, spurred them into action. They ran towards the wall, their feet kicking up clouds of sand, their faces set with determination. The heat from the fire was growing more intense, a searing wave that threatened to engulf them. They could hear the roar of the flames, a deafening sound that filled the air, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked behind them. They reached the wall, their hands finding the cracks and crevices that allowed them to climb. They moved quickly, their movements fluid and practiced, their bodies responding to the urgency of the situation. Zephyr was among them, his mind focused, his body working in perfect harmony. He reached the top of the wall and looked back, his eyes widening as he saw the wall of fire, a raging inferno that seemed to stretch to the heavens. He didn't linger, though. He climbed down the other side, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The others were right behind him, their faces etched with fear and determination. They continued to run, the wall of fire a constant presence, a force that drove them forward, that pushed them to their limits. The desert was a blur, a landscape that shifted and changed with every passing second, a maze of sand and heat that seemed to have no end. And then the third wall appeared, its approach faster and more menacing. But this time, something was different. Zephyr noticed it almost immediately, a subtle difference in the movement of the wall, a variation that caught his eye. He slowed down, his eyes narrowing as he studied the wall, his mind working quickly. One end of the wall was moving noticeably faster than the other, a discrepancy that seemed out of place, a clue that hinted at something more. "It's moving, in a circle," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning, a sudden insight that changed everything. They were not just facing a series of walls, they were trapped in a circle, a never-ending loop that was pushing them towards the fire. "The wall is rotating around a center," Zephyr yelled, his voice carrying over the roar of the flames and the pounding of feet. "If we can find the center, we might be safe." Quilthos, who was running beside him, turned to look at him, his eyes wide with understanding. "That's brilliant, Zephyr," he shouted, his voice filled with admiration. "You've figured it out." But not everyone heard Zephyr's words, or if they did, they were too panicked or too focused on the upcoming wall to pay attention. Their faces were etched with fear, their eyes fixed on the approaching monolith, their minds consumed by the need to escape. "Listen to me," Zephyr called out again, desperation in his voice. "We need to head towards the center. It's our only chance." But his words were lost in the chaos, drowned out by the sound of the fire and the relentless approach of the wall. The contenders were scattered, their movements frantic, their actions driven by instinct rather than reason. Quilthos grabbed Zephyr's arm, his grip firm and unyielding. "We have to go, Zephyr," he said, his voice urgent. "We have to head towards the center, now." Zephyr looked at him, his eyes filled with determination. He knew that Quilthos was right. They had to move, and they had to move fast. The wall was getting closer, and the fire was not going to wait. With a nod, he turned and started running, his mind clear, his body responding to the challenge. Quilthos was right beside him, their strides matching, their movements synchronized. They were heading towards the center, towards safety, towards a place where the walls could not reach them. It was a gamble, a risk, but it was their only chance. The contenders, roughly half of them, were running towards the slower-moving end of the wall, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their minds focused on the goal. The walls kept coming, one after the other, each one faster than the last, each one a new challenge to overcome. But as they got closer to the center, the walls' approach more frequent as the distance between them grew shorter. The desert was a blur, the sand a shifting sea, the walls a relentless force that pushed them forward, driving them towards the center. They climbed over the next wall, their movements fluid and practiced, their bodies responding to the rhythm of the challenge. They climbed over the next one, and the next one, their pace unrelenting, their determination unwavering. Finally they saw it, the middle, the point where all the walls intersected, the place where the fire could not reach them. It was a beacon of hope, a symbol of safety, a destination that promised respite and relief. They climbed the wall, their muscles aching, their breath ragged, their hearts pounding. They made their way towards the center, their steps sure and steady, their minds clear and focused. And there, sitting in the center, was Shratz, the small insect-like creature, its many legs tucked beneath its body, its eyes gleaming with intelligence and satisfaction. It looked up as they approached, its head tilting to one side, its expression one of curiosity and recognition. The contenders stopped, their bodies still, their minds reeling. They had made it. They had reached the center. They looked back, their eyes widening as they saw some contenders still frantically climbing over the walls in the far distance. The cries of a contender reached their ears, a sound of desperation and fear as they moved into the wall of fire. The sound was quickly silenced, leaving a chilling void in its wake. The remaining contenders gathered around the center with Shratz, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. They could feel themselves spinning in a circle at an ever-increasing pace, the world around them a blur, the desert a shifting sea. "Wait for me," yelled a voice, strong and deep, filled with determination and power. It was Chubumbus the Powerful, a large, very strong-looking creature, his muscles bulging, his eyes filled with resolve. He was running on top of the wall, his feet pounding against the surface, his body a mass of energy and strength. The contenders watched, their breath held, their hearts in their throats, as Chubumbus reached the center, his movements fluid and graceful, his body a testament to his power and skill. He was the last contender to join up with the group in the middle. Above them, a structure began to materialize, its form taking shape in the sky. It was an upside-down pyramid, its base pointing towards the heavens, its apex aimed at the ground. The pyramid was stable, unmoving, a stark contrast to the chaos below. The contenders felt the ground beneath them begin to spin faster and faster. The walls that had once been their challenge now stretched out from the center, spinning at tremendous speeds. Sand whipped through the air, a storm of grit and dust that obscured their vision and stung their skin. The wind howled around them, a deafening roar that filled their ears and rattled their bones. It was as if they were in the center of a hurricane, a tornado, a maelstrom of nature's fury. And then, without warning, the pyramid opened up, its sides splitting apart to reveal a dark, gaping void. Gravity seemed to shift, to twist, to pull at them with an irresistible force. They were no longer standing on solid ground. They were falling, tumbling, being drawn upwards into the opening of the pyramid. The contenders reached out, their hands grasping at the air, their bodies twisting and turning as they were pulled into the darkness. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with fear and wonder, their faces pale and drawn. They were falling up into the unknown, into the pyramid. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The darkness swallowed them whole, the pyramid closed behind them, and they were gone. The desert was still once more, the walls gone, the sand settled, the wind quiet. The pyramid had vanished, leaving behind only the memory of its presence, the echo of its power. Hey, space explorers, join us on this cosmic journey and help shape our story. Want to steer our adventure? Comment below with your ideas, alien encounters, cosmic mysteries. You decide. Our AI will choose the most exciting ones to build our story. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Until next time, keep exploring.